Day, 3rd and 4th grade. Mr. Cleghorn here. We're back again talking about history. Now remember in chapter 7, the first part of 7, we talked about the churches, about the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Anglicans. We talked about the Mennonites, and we talked about the...
Hey, it's Anglicans. Anglicans.
What?
Can you say that after me, Michael? Anglicans.
Anglicans.
Not Angelicans. Anglicans.
Okay.
And then Mennonites. I don't know how you said it before.
Thank you, Mrs. Cleghorn.
But it's Mennonite. Repeat after me. Mennonite.
Okay.
Anyway, so we're talking about chapter 6, 7...
Is this like a stick that they use to poke people?
Oh, you mean like in the service when they've fallen asleep?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
This might have been what they used, something like that.
I'm awake, I'm listening.
All
listening.
right.
Are you listening? Alright, let's start. So right now we are on page 75, bottom of page 75. We're talking about, oh, that's cool, schools. Almost every colonist believed that children in America needed a good education. The colonists built schools that would give the children what they needed. Many children began their education in a dame school. A lady would agree to teach their children at home. She taught the children reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. The children had no nice classrooms, and there were very few school books. Most children used a hornbook to learn the alphabet. A hornbook was a paddle-shaped board to which was attached one sheet of paper containing the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. Kind of like this right here. See that? The book was called a hornbook because the thin sheet of transparent cow's horn covered the paper to protect it. A child had memorized the hornbook, he could begin reading New England Primer, the most widely used textbook in all of colonial America. This book had lists of words of prayers, poems about Bible stories, and short stories about doing right, in which gave religious instruction as well as training in reading. For over 150 years, millions of American children learned to read from the New England Primer. After that, they would read the Bible, and almost all of them would also read Pilgrim's Progress. After staying in a dame school for over a year or two, the boys might go on to get more education. Girls usually stayed home and learned to bake, cook, and sew, and make yarn and cloth, and candles and soap, so that they could care for their families when they grew older. Because American colonists wanted to make sure their children got a good education, they passed laws ordering cities to build schools and provide education for the public. People knew that learning about God meant reading the Bible, and reading the Bible meant learning to read. The first public schools in America were built by the Puritans in New England. As early as 1647, New England had passed a law ordering cities to build schools for children. Many schools opened their doors to eager children throughout New England. New England even opened the first college in America, Harvard, which started in 1636 to train ministers to preach the gospel. When Harvard College was started, its leaders said, "Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and his studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life." John 17:3. And therefore lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. The middle colonies had fewer schools than the New England colonies. Farms were larger here, and people lived farther apart than in New England. Schools were so far apart that many children could not walk the distance. Even so, when there was a school, children had to walk as far as 2 or 4 miles one way to reach the one-room schoolhouse. Those who lived farther away were taught by their parents or were not taught at all. Schools in the middle colonies usually had just one room with roughly made benches. Almost always, these children were taught by strict men teachers. Sometimes a minister of a church would be the teacher of a school. He would hold his school in the church. In colonial days, paper was much too expensive for students to use. Pieces of birch bark were stripped from trees and used in place of paper. A book of lead or coal was used as a pencil. A piece of lead or coal was used as a pencil. Books were not very plentiful. Usually the school had only one copy of each book it used. Each student waited for his turn to use the book. You guys imagine that? For a long time, there were not many schools in the South. Wealthy farmers lived in huge homes apart from each other. They could afford tutors to come to their homes and teach children privately. Of course, the poor people could not afford to build schools. Eventually, parents in some areas of the South started to get together to hire a teacher for their children. The teacher and students would meet in a shabby building in an old field, in what was called the Old Field School. A boy named George Washington attended this kind of school. One year, he had to ride on horseback every day to his Old Field School, which was 10 miles from home. Another year, he rode a boat across the river every day, even when it was storming, to get to school. Industry. America offered Europeans the promise of a better life. Europeans who came to America found that the promise was true. Not only could they worship God freely and give their children a good education, but they also could work and enjoy the fruit of their labors. People who had lived in poverty in Europe came to America and grew wealthy. For the first part of its history, America's chief industry was farming. One of the first things that most colonists did in America was to plant a garden. After the Indians showed them how to plant corn, the colonists planted large farms, and corn became a chief food crop. Colonists ate corn at every meal. They even ate popcorn with milk and sugar as a breakfast food. New England farmers had to work hard through the rough New England soil was rocky and hilly. The colonists in the middle colonies found farming was much easier, but the southern farmers were the most prosperous of all. The soil was rich and the weather was warm. Anything that the farmers planted grew. Cotton provided to be a good crop. Unfortunately, tobacco became popular in Europe, and many farmers in the South planted it. The large southern plantation resembled a miniature city. Everything the farmer needed was right on his farm. The plantations were so large that sometimes there was no roads between them. The people would travel down to a river to reach the next plantation. Gradually, some colonists left farming and began to manufacture goods. The goods were mostly everyday necessities, such as things as cloth, pots, and pans. Molasses and other goods were produced and sold in America. People in New England were made fishing a major industry. People in Europe were not interested in most of America's products. For example, no one wanted to buy a plain American cloth or a homespun. Most goods sent to Europe were raw materials. Europeans purchased indigo, a blue dye common in America but precious in Europe. They bought lumber from the vast forests of America. They bought American iron, tobacco, and furs, including beaver furs to make hats and other articles. All right. The trade ships carrying these things to Europe would bring back the goods that the colonists wanted to buy. One of the most important popular items was the European cloth. Clothes from Europe were much nicer than American clothes and were valued highly in the colonies. America needed Europe's manufactured goods because there were still not very many factories in America. Still, there were few American products that were valued in Europe. The colonists' simple, durable furniture appealed to the Europeans. For example, Benjamin Franklin attached rockers to a slant-back chair to produce the classic American rocking chair, which then became extremely popular throughout Europe. American silversmiths also manufactured goods that came from European standards, that came up to European standards. These fine craftsmen turned lumps of silver into fine pieces of art, tea services, and dinnerware that graced the tables of many wealthy people. One of the best silversmiths in America was named Paul Revere. Revere loved his silver, but he also loved freedom, as all American colonists did. His love of freedom was to make him famous during the War for Independence that ended the colonial age. And we're going to talk about Christopher Duck. Duck. Oh, sorry. Pause. Cut.